Hello, glad to see you on my channel. I really value it. And today I want to share with you a wonderful story. It's a dramatic story that will come as a total shock to everybody. It is a really amazing story. So enjoy watching it.
John hated his life. He fiercely, silently hated his present existence. Everything that had once seemed to him so desirable, so important. Outside the window, a blizzard roared, and it was not a cozy, ordinary winter blizzard, which could easily end in the morning, revealing snow-white and silver expanses under a shining turquoise sky. It was such a blizzard, which falls on the ground with primal fury and can drag on for many days, in fact, cutting off their small town from the outside world completely. In short, winter in Alaska was no joke. John took a sip from the bottle and glanced gloomily at the empty glass containers scattered on the floor. Damn it. Sometimes he felt sick to the stomach that he was sinking further and further, but he couldn't help it. Alcohol seemed to John the last outlet, which allowed him to somehow reconcile with the surrounding reality. He once thought he was a lucky man, that he had caught, as they call it, luck by the tail. It all started almost 20 years ago, when he was a green kid, came to America on the program of the Park and Travel, realizing the dream that so many students were so eager to pursue. His parents denied themselves everything, borrowed money from acquaintances, but sent him here. Young John flew to the USA and opened his mouth, what is called from amazement and great hopes. For some reason, it seemed to him that once he got here, it automatically means that he is a millionaire without 5 minutes. Well, there were just such ambitions of the student of a provincial university who studied better than everyone else in his course. In general, it was supposed that John would return home later and become a manager, live with his parents, become their support in his old age, but love intervened, or something like it. Just one day at the amusement park, John met a beautiful woman named Stella while waiting in line. The statuesque, tanned blonde and pink, captivated his heart, and the native Maria, whom he knew from the sandbox and whom he promised to marry one day, was forgotten. Stella, as John realized at once, was a girl of a wealthy family. She loved the beautiful life, and her daddy, who owned something connected with oil production, provided her with this life. No, if John was asked at that moment whether he was dating an American heiress out of convenience, he would have answered that it was vulgar and rude. It was all about true love. And only much later, already looking back, he realized yes, Stella in many ways conquered him just by the fact that could, theoretically, provide him, as they say, the golden ticket to a better life. Stella was, what is called, Daddy's daughter. Her mother died many years ago, and her father did not marry a second time because he did not want to traumatize the childhood of his beloved star, as she was called by friends and family, the presence of a stepmother. John knew in his mind that he was not the best match for Stella, but her father, to his amazement, welcomed him warmly. "I want her to be happy," he said. The serious conversation took place in the study on a ranch in the heart of Texas, where Mr. Smith and his daughter usually spent their summer vacations. "I know you bought an engagement ring." A grin touched George's lips. "You bought it with the money she gives you for pocket change." John's fist clenched at this blatant mockery of his future father-in-law, and the fact that he realized it meant that he had not imagined it, that Mr. Smith had detectives reporting on his every move. "I just had to make sure you weren't the kind of guy who'd go off the deep end," George said, as if he read John's mind, but he didn't specify what it was that made some guys go off the deep end. "And here's what I think. My girl could have chosen someone better. You know, at first I thought I'd offer you 50 grand to stop hitting on her, and maybe you'd go for it. But I know for a fact Stella really loves you, and that's why I have to agree to this marriage. I've accomplished a lot, as you can see," he said, waving his hands as if to urge the boy to look around. John nodded. He understood the height Mr. Smith was at. The study was finished in natural wood. The furniture was upholstered in genuine leather. Behind the tall French windows, many acres of land. On the walls were trophies brought from hunts all over the world, deer heads, one rhinoceros, and on the floor a white tiger skin. "Only I didn't save my wife," George said in a confidential tone. "I've only got Sprocket left, and I'm ready to give you her hand as a father. And you, lad, Don't think you owe me much now. Your main duty is to make her happy. Don't let me down." The last words were spoken with a clear threat. "I won't," John nodded. That was all he could say, because Mr. Smith's tongue did not turn to say that he loved his daughter seemed to sting from these words of falsity, which he would feel in. Well, perhaps then the magnificent antique gun hanging under the head of the rhinoceros would come into play. John's parents were horrified at the news that he had decided to stay in the U.S., changing his visa as a student traveler and a bit of a worker to a fiancé visa. This is not what they had hoped for. "Mom, Dad, fly to the wedding." John began to try to reconcile. "You have no more mother or father," his father shouted and threw the phone down. It was very hard for John, but in this choice, he stayed on the side where the American dream shone with tantalizing lights. Soon they were married, unusually quiet and orderly compared to the kind of weddings John had been to before. No one shouted bitter. The guests were prim and played live jazz. George announced that John should study to enter an American university, something from the legendary Ivy League, and then promised to bring him into the family business. Soon Stella announced that she was expecting a child. And then it all went wrong, like a snowball coming down the mountain. And it all started when Mr. Smith's company did something in Alaska. John had never seen his father-in-law like this before, and what he saw frightened him. "It's all over," shouted George, addressing no one in particular. "Idiots, it's over." Then a shot rang out and he blew to pieces with a shotgun the portrait of his distant ancestor, Rudolph Smith, who had been the first to make his fortune mining gold in Alaska. There was a certain amount of commotion in the house. There were lawyers coming in all the time. Stella was crying. John couldn't understand what was going on at all. He only found out that George's employees had a corporate party in Alaska and decided to go hunting and shot some animals, as if they were from a reserve or some rare beast they got. Anyway, George fired them all. John understood a little about local business and decided that his father-in-law was upset, probably because his reputation had been damaged, although he was getting a little too upset. Then it turned out that George's company had accidentally polluted some lake, and the damage was so great. In general, there were millions of dollars in fines, and it was necessary to compensate the local residents and restore nature as much as possible. In short, at one point a successful business was on the verge of bankruptcy. John himself was now in shock, and this was not the life he had hoped for. He kept asking Stella if they were going to be poor. She cried and said that he was a fool who only had money on his mind, and that it was much more serious than that. And then one night John was awakened by screams throughout the house, voices belonging to Stella and her father. Climbing out of bed and blinking like an owl startled by a flashlight, John stalked toward the sounds. "No, Daddy, don't. You can't stand it," cried Stella, with tears in her voice. "I must, daughter. It's the only way out." "No, Daddy, please. You won't come back. Like Uncle Morris, like Robert." "Shut up. We all do what we have to do. You always knew that. If Mom were alive, she wouldn't let you go." "Don't say that. She would have. It's lucky she's dead." Stella squealed. "She can't see how you're ruining yourself. Damn you. Damn that Rudolph who started all this. Who's the reason our family is cursed? I'll." John was just about to grab the handle of the door to the study when he heard the sound of a slap. He walked in and they froze, frozen, turning their heads to him. Stella wept, pressing her palm to her cheek, and George collected, straight, focused. A valise stood at his feet. Picking it up, he walked swiftly out the study. As he passed John, he glanced at him briefly and said, "Take care of her and my grandson." He already knew he and Stella were expecting a boy. For a few days, John was walking around like a dream. There were lawyers, attorneys, business managers, and business partners in Stella, and all of them seemed to be just signing papers. John wasn't interested in what for and why. He was more concerned about the fact that they might have to live in a trailer park soon. And then another man showed up at the house, and he wasn't like the previous ones. He was a Mexican. "I want Stella," he said without even saying hello when John opened the door. "The gardener?" he asked. "What, you're late with your paycheck? We're in a financial crisis. Get Stella." The Mexican squinted. "Look, man, I don't understand." "Pedro, Stella, who came down the hall at that moment, turned white as a sheet. Her eyes widened, and she put her hand on her stomach in an instinctive defense gesture. "You promised that you would bring the money." Pedro threw angrily at her. "You cheated." "I'll bring it." "Please, Pedro, don't. You have to wait." "Wait?" The Mexican shouted with spittle. "You lied to me. You're not carrying the money, and that's why I won't keep quiet anymore." And then he turned to John, who didn't understand anything at all. "I'm the father of her child. She cheated on you, you idiot." John couldn't believe his ears. Yes, he and Stella had some problems in their relationship during the period when she announced the pregnancy, but not so much that she. And then John remembered Pedro really worked at the ranch, only he wasn't a gardener, he was cleaning the pool. "Darling, I can explain." Stella rushed toward John, but he recoiled squeamishly. He suddenly realized that fate was treating him extremely unfairly. First, his family, on whose help he had counted so much, had gone bankrupt, and now his wife had given him horns. "Go away." John retreated into the interior of the house, paying no attention to the quarrel between the Mexican and Stella downstairs. Walking into the office that had been occupied until a short time ago by George, John walked around the large desk and carefully lowered himself into the luxurious leather chair. He leaned back and closed his eyes. This was the big boss's chair, and he might someday take it over, taking over the family business, for Stella understood only in rags, lipsticks, and parties. But apparently, everything would have to be sold off, including this chair, and there would still be some left over. John dozed off in the chair, and then he was awakened by a maid. Her name was Martha. She was over 60 and the last of the other servants to be fired. "What happened?" John asked, because Martha's face was in tears. With a trembling hand, she handed him the phone and he was informed. Anyway, Stella had gotten into Pedro's car for some reason. Maybe they decided to talk outside the estate. They'd barely gotten on the road when there was a terrible car accident. Pedro was killed on the spot. Stella was taken to the hospital where she gave birth to a baby boy, and then she died. The baby was born about 3 weeks premature, and doctors were fighting for his life. And just like that, the times that seemed the worst became even worse. John didn't want to look at the baby at first. He was a stranger. But then, he made himself do it. The baby was not like him at all. It was clear from the first glance. And in general, there was, of course, the option that the baby could be abandoned to the orphanage. But John didn't do it. Not only because he realized that he felt something for Stella and such an act would be disgusting, but mainly because he thought that this baby is, in fact, the only link between him and all the wealth of the Smiths, from which to be able to save and grab a piece. However, very soon it became clear that the old as if acquaintances and business partners of George are not eager to help John. After all, he was nothing to them. Besides, there were already rumors of Stella having an affair with the maid. "So there's nothing," John finished gloomily for the lawyer who had come to summarize the financially miserable story. "So I'm a pauper." It had been about a year since the automobile accident. The ranch has been sold at auction. All the property had been sold off too. All John had left was Stella's wedding present. He and his son moved into a small apartment in a poor neighborhood, and to have something to live on. John went to work in a car service, but money ran away like sand through his fingers. After all, it was necessary to pay for housing, a nanny, and food for Michael, as John decided to name his son. John himself had no money even for insurance. It was a bad situation. "Actually, that's exactly what I came to talk about," said the lawyer, who, all big man in a suit for at least $2,000, looked alien and ridiculous in a shabby and in some places holey chair furniture in the apartment corresponded to its price. "The thing is, do you mind if I leave out the details?" John nodded and the lawyer continued. "The point is that we were able to get one of Mr. Smith's properties off the market. It's a real estate property. He owned a house. Yes." John's heart quickened and he moved forward in hope. The lawyer continued. "It turned out that this house is very good. Located almost in the center of the city, it was built by a famous architect. It was a property suitable for living. It had everything you need already. There is only one nuance," the lawyer said cautiously. "The location of the property." "Oh, come on," chuckled John. "What could be worse than this hole?" And he waved his hand as if pointing to the surroundings. He was already imagining how he could sell the house and use the proceeds to buy something modest and get back on his feet. He had already imagined that fate had finally turned its face to him, and that it was not an insidious grin, but a benevolent smile. And how wrong he was. "This object is located in Alaska," said the lawyer and pointed to a town, the name of which, of course, meant nothing to John. He listened to the rest as if in a fog, that this town was once prosperous, but since the 80s is in decline, but still it is a good place, including to raise a child because there is ecologically clean nature, low crime rate. After this conversation, John felt even worse than before. He was not going to go to Alaska. Well, to be more precise, for some time he was categorically against this then. But of course he signed the necessary documents. Then John tried to sell the house, and still, for what price? "I'm afraid no one wants it," the realtor told him 3 months later. "Understand, the locals already have their own houses, and there are 2 hotels for tourists. I'm afraid it's a hopeless venture." John sighed, and although he didn't want to, he was beginning to think that maybe moving to Alaska wasn't such a bad idea. After all, it's civilization too, and will not have to pay for the apartment. Recently, John began to drink a little alcohol. At work, began to argue and threaten to fire. Actually, theoretically, John had one more option to return home to his parents. But the thing was how they behaved. No, they sympathized with the fact that their son had lost his wife, and his father-in-law was missing, by the way. But they clearly made it clear who they considered John to be the loser. And when he said he was coming, of course, with his son, that's when it started. He was honest and admitted that the boy wasn't his, but that he was attached to him. John's mother shouted into the phone and he threw the phone against the wall. No, he decided that if it was Alaska, it was Alaska. The move ate up his already modest savings, so he had to push his pride to the back of his mind and visit the local food bank. The house turned out to be impressive. The lawyer was a little mistaken. He stood not quite in the center of the city, but closer to its outskirts. This one-story building was, "I can't wait, understand." John was indignant. "What am I supposed to do? Take the boy to work? He's going to lie between a wrench and a disassembled engine." That day back home, John got really drunk for the first time. "Well, who else is there?" he grumbled as he walked to the front door, which was banging and banging. "Hello." There was a woman at the door. About 30 years old by the looks of it, a blonde woman much older than Estella, and not so well groomed, not pretty at all, but how brightly, welcomingly she smiled. "Here, this is for you," she said and handed John a still warm dish. He lifted the checkered kitchen towel, and under it was a pie. With cranberries and apples, the stranger continued to smile. "Mom's signature recipe. We live up there," she said, and waved her hand toward the mountain, a gray-white mass in the distance against the sky. John squinted his eyes, and he knew that there were a few houses there, well, of the urban poor, so the stranger was from there. She stomped silently to the door. He sighed. If she'd just dropped by to say hello to the newcomer, he could have said he didn't have any guests and closed the door, but she brought a pie, so it would have been swinish to turn her out. The only thing left to do was to invite her inside and offer to have tea with her. The stranger, who introduced herself as Jessica, was very chatty. She asked John about everything. Then she told him about her mother, who had worked as a teacher all her life, teaching French and Latin. They traveled all over America, and so they come from Canada. Father died many years ago. Jessica herself worked as a waitress now, because it is very convenient, because you need to look after your mom's. Michael grew up and, at first, it seemed that everything was normal. He went to school like everyone else, enrolled in the Boy Scouts. But then, in general, John suddenly became clearly and with a painful dislike to realize that this is not his own son. Michael had an impetuous, hot temper. He was so emotional. However, this could be blamed on his mother-in-law's upbringing, and she was always reading him her strange books. They chatted in French or even in Latin. "She'll make him crazy," John once told Jessica. She shook her head and smiled meekly. "More like educated. You know, my mom was such a teacher in her day. A tutor for millionaires. Yes. Then why are you here?" John grinned wickedly. "I'm sorry, but your mom's weird, muttering about snow spirits, about demons guarding the gold." But she's a good person, Jessica said thoughtfully. She's just had a rough youth in Canada. All right, that's enough. I'm going to work. This kind of talk always annoyed John. Time flew on. Life went on as usual, and it seemed that one could get used to everything and had already gotten used to it. It seemed that now one could breathe easy. But then disaster struck again. Michael was diagnosed with a rare disease. The boy had just turned 15 years old, and suddenly his arms and legs began to fail. John, no matter how he felt about the guy, but still felt terrible, he did not want his son such a fate. Naturally, he began to go to doctors, once even saved up, borrowed from friends and took Michael to Vancouver there. They said there are the right specialists, but their gate the final blow said that without expensive, for millions of dollars of treatment, to 20 years or even earlier, Michael will sit in a wheelchair. John fell into despondency. Now at home was not only crazy mother-in-law, who, despite the presence of a cane, cheerfully rustled everywhere and took the habit, sneak up unnoticed from the back, which frightened him to the horror, as well as the son stayed at home. Michael all day spent in bed. Friends' buddies, which is already a little guy, was completely abandoned him. In general, John did not like that his son is not only sick, but also a nerd. Even so, at school, Michael, by the way, not particularly liked. Quiet, nerdy, but he's so full of himself. You're an idiot, John yelled at the kid. You're not normal at all. What kind of success in life is that? If you can walk to the bathroom in a year, that's the ceiling of your success. No, Michael said stubbornly and flashed his brown eyes from beneath tangled bangs the color of a crow's wing. Grandma Emma says that anyone can get anything they want. It's just a matter of price. Grandma? John snapped. What kind of grandmother is she to you? You know she's just an old woman, the mother of my second wife, and you're not my son. Stella got you pregnant by a pool cleaner. I left you because who else would want you like that? Have you seen yourself in the mirror? You don't even look like me. He shouted that, and then he stopped talking and froze because of the way his son looked at him. The truth had come out like a volcano erupting, and there was no turning back. Michael, John wanted to explain everything to make up for the pain he'd caused, but it was all in his son's face. But he closed his eyes as if he were shutting himself off. Don't, just go away. John didn't insist and just walked out. And from then on, he and his son talked even less. He decided that he would not bring up the subject until Michael himself decided that he wanted to do it. Well, and if he didn't want to, that was his business. In general, John was beginning to think that 2 disabled people in the house is a lot, and perhaps it would be possible to put Jessica's mother or son in a proper institution and let the people around him judge. He doesn't care how many times he'd spend his best years in a way he wouldn't wish on an enemy. But it seemed that fate had some very special and very sinister and evil plans for John, because shortly after this conversation took place, and Michael was already 18 years old, Jessica suddenly passed away. Just one day in the middle of her shift, she collapsed to the floor, senseless, and, as the doctor said later, with her heart already stopped. And then, as if John hadn't been through enough, he was suddenly thrown out of work. Just some tough guy came to town, obviously rich, in an SUV. He went to the service to check the engine. It was a matter of 5 minutes, and John was sure that he did everything right. But a day later, the tourist returned with a claim to say, because of John's work, his car stalled in the middle of the road. It is broken. The repair will cost $30,000 at least. The owner of the car service barely calmed down the raging client and suggested that actually, the repair will cost much cheaper, and as an apology, they will do everything for free. And he also fired John. He apologized and lowered his eyes and said that, you know, guy, you're an outsider, and I have to take care of my reputation. A stranger? John was indignant. I've been here 15 years. That's one day in Alaska, the boss replied. And besides, you're not an American at all. Thank you. I mean, everything was fine up until now, and now this. John was outraged to the extreme. He was so hurt. By the way, I heard about your wife. I'm sorry for your loss. You and your condolences, you damn hypocrite. John shouted and stormed out of the office. How sick he felt, but he had to hang on a little longer. There was a funeral ahead of him. Then acquaintances came to the house. Neighbors also expressed their sympathy. Mother-in-law sat in a corner and muttered again her own. The next day, John lay in bed. At lunchtime, he went downstairs and grimaced, of course, who should keep the house warm. The old woman had gone to herself, rambling over her books, and the son was an invalid. He had to start the heating system himself. Then I had to do the cooking. I had to feed my son myself, and that old woman. John had never really learned to cook over the years, so he just opened a couple of cans of canned beans, added a can of canned meat, and heated everything up in a pan. Then he slept again, and so the day went on. By evening, a snowstorm began, and realizing that by morning it would completely block the door like a mole until the next noon, John went out to shovel snow. At the same time, he shoveled the mail out of the mailbox, which he hadn't looked in for days. He threw all the correspondence on the table by the front door and was about to go to bed, but then one of the envelopes caught his eye. He opened it and rounded his eyes because it was a claim for a debt of $2,000. John read it again and he rushed to his mother-in-law. "Are you crazy? Hadn't you had enough of this?" he questioned, pointing to the bookshelf where Emma kept all kinds of dusty tomes. "You old fool." The thing was, Emma had managed to take out a loan somewhere. How could they do that in her condition? Anyway, she took out a loan and bought some old books, and now those books are flying off the shelves. "You think I'm gonna pay for you? You think I have patience for you? Get your stuff and get out of my house." My daughter lived here, and I live here," Emma mumbled, staring at him with clear blue eyes that barely blinked. "Jessica's dead, and you're nothing to me. Get up." He grabbed Emma by the scruff of the neck and dragged her to the door. He threw a down jacket over her shoulders, put a hat on her head. He went to the bookshelves and raked through several volumes. When he returned, he was surprised to see that Emma had already put on her shoes. John grinned triumphantly, which meant he figured it out, old girl. He shoved the books at her chest, but she didn't pick them up. They fell to the floor. John swung open the front door and a blizzard blew in. "Go on. Go, I don't know. Go to your friends or wherever you want." In general, John, even in a calm state, could not remember and who in the town could be considered friends of Emma. She was the most unsociable here. But he didn't care. The main thing was to get the old woman out of this house, because he was determined that he would not live with her. Emma bowed her head, long strands of gray from under her hat, and without even buttoning her down jacket, walked out the door. John slammed the door so hard that the glass rattled. "I don't want to see you again, old girl," he shouted through the door. And then he just went into the kitchen, emptied the fridge of the rest of the hot drinks, and went into the living room and plopped down on the couch. At first, he just listened to the blizzard howl and waited for Emma to start scratching back. John thought that he would let the old woman in. She might be smarter after a walk. But time passed, and Emma didn't ask to go back. John chuckled. Perhaps she had gone to one of the neighbors. The morning was so clear that the sunlight streaming through the windows made John's eyes ache. The man groaned as his back went stiff. He found he'd fallen asleep on the couch. He wrinkled his nose. What a night! On the head, along with an agonizing hangover, hit the memories of his mother-in-law out the door. John jumped up from the sofa, stepped on the bottle, and the glass cracked under his foot. Punctured his slipper and he, swearing, skidding on one leg, cut himself. But it didn't seem deep, and so he just put a band-aid on it. His throat was thirsty, and John drank greedily from the tap. He knew he should look out the door, but he was afraid to find his mother-in-law's body curled and stiff with frost. And yet, whatever happens, John said and unlocked the door. No, her mother-in-law was not lying on the doorstep. He put on his jacket and went outside and walked around the house. It was lucky that yesterday only a snowplow car came here in the town and the monthly payments in the winter included its services. His mother-in-law was still nowhere to be found, and her footprints, of course, had drifted away, because although closer to morning, it seemed to be snowing less, but it was still falling. Cussing again at the whole situation and at his aching leg, John took a shovel and started to walk around. He gingerly poked at the small snowdrifts and was afraid that now he would find his mother-in-law. Then he scattered the snow and No, there was none. So therefore, Emma had really gone. John sighed heavily and licked his lips nervously. It had been a long time since he'd been so drunk. What a mess! He went back into the house. "What are you doing here?" he shouted at his son, who was in the kitchen. The boy could hardly stand on his crutches, but he looked at his father so independently, with such a sense of dignity that it gave him goosebumps. "What am I supposed to do? Lie around and wait for you to make me breakfast? Fortunately, I can still take care of myself." Well, I'm not saying anything," John said in a conciliatory tone. "It's good, of course, that you are independent." He wanted to add the word "for now," but held back. There was nothing, in fact, whatever their relationship, to press on the painful, and that as they both knew the inevitable. "Are you going to have scrambled eggs? Do you want me to cook for you?" Michael asked, spreading strips of bacon in the pan. A deafening aroma wafted through the kitchen, making me drool. "I will," John said, walking over to the coffee pot. "Michael, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "If you mean my origin, I don't want to talk about it," the young man interrupted softly but firmly. "I just want to live and be healthy. And the past, what is. It cannot change. You just have to accept it." "Good," nodded John, who was deep down glad that his son didn't want to continue this difficult subject. "I hear you've been fighting with your grandmother." "It was nothing, not a big deal," John smiled. Emma never had breakfast with them, and that was convenient in this case, or Michael would have noticed her absence and would have started asking questions, to which John himself had no answers. Finally, after breakfast, the son went to his room. John knew he would be surfing the internet all day, which meant that he had at least time to try to find his mother-in-law before dinner, which he would have to cook himself. More than anything else, Emma Stone regretted that she had once realized her dream. How foolish she had been. Neve, madly passionate about her work girl, she, a simple girl who grew up in a small town in Canada, the outside world was seen as a treasure trove from which you, if you study well and then work hard, you can get everything you want. But who would have warned this naive little girl that there are monsters in the outside world, hiding their hellfire blazing mouths full of poisonous fangs behind the friendly smiles of successful, strong, great people? Too late, Emma realized that sometimes power and wealth come at too high a price no normal person would pay. Her parents, mom a teacher and dad a fireman, were quiet, peaceful people, and they didn't interfere when Emma claimed she had won a grant to attend a prestigious university. She went after her dream, secretly even a little bit despising her humble provincial life left behind. She had no doubt that she was worthy of so much more. At university, Emma didn't do silly things like parties and novels she studied. Her professors held her up as an example. No one could keep up with her. So it was no surprise that shortly before graduation, she was sent on an exchange to France. What a magical time it was. Emma wandered the streets of a town founded in the early Middle Ages, but as a tourist, she didn't see much on that trip because she spent all her time in libraries, where she studied materials so important for a deep understanding of the essence of the French language. And it was there that Emma fell in love with Latin. What a beautiful, interesting Latin it was. Teachers in France, by the way, also admired the diligent student, and one day, Emma was invited to a private party. At first, she wanted to refuse because there was no time for such nonsense, but there was to gather some of the elite of the professor, as well as the patrons of the university, that is, those who made generous donations for him, and she agreed. It was there that she met a man. His name was Louis, and they got to talking about their shared interest in the history of the beast from Gévaudan. Louis intellectually but scathingly and mercilessly ridiculed Emma, who adhered to the classical theory that the monster that had slaughtered several hundred people in the French county of Gévaudan in the 18th century had been a pet hyena that had been let loose on the wild by some mad aristocrat, or a trivial mixture of wolf and dog. Louis gave, as he said, strong evidence that this beast was a creature of that nature, which the weak brains of most people cannot comprehend. And he added that similar incidents happened later, across the ocean in the French possessions in America, that is, in Canada. And he also said something curious. According to legends, this beast could provide those who were able to curb it, with wealth and prosperity. "What nonsense," said Emma, who had been strangely agitated by this Louis. He did not take offense and only smiled charmingly and said that there are, of course, fairy tales. But personally, he believed what they said in his family about the founder of the family wealth, great-great-grandfather, who sailed to Canada for a better share. After this strange encounter, Emma began to study in the library not only those books that could be useful to a linguist, but also other literature. She became curious about what kind of occult beliefs about the beast from Chihuahua. She and Louis never saw each other again, but he found her when she went back to Canada. He showed up right at graduation and made a generous offer. He said he was a kind of philanthropist and had young boys and girls in his care, from disadvantaged and vice versa from very influential families. But the origin doesn't matter, because in fact, all these boys are very talented, and he, so please him, organizes for them a summer vacation in his huge country house. There they have fun, do sports, but most importantly learn. They deeply study sciences, which will help them to take a worthy place in the world, and learning languages plays a big part in that. Louis said that Emma could work for him as a French tutor, and she agreed. The place, known as Moonwolf Manor, was extraordinary. Emma was warmly welcomed. Her students were young people from 16 to 22 years old on average, were very well-mannered, had no bad habits. They made an impression. Well, such an impression that in the future here, they are definitely waiting for happiness, prosperity, success, luck. They greedily absorbed all the knowledge. Emma was surprised to note that they were eagerly learning not only French, Italian, Chinese, Arabic, German, and other languages, but also Greek and Latin. They did not organize silly parties in this place, but they held costume dance parties, favoring the first half of the 19th century and the end of the 18th century. Emma was surprised that these young people were all learning to wield weapons, not modern, but medieval, in particular crossbows. They attended some strange meditations. In general, the atmosphere in the Moonwolf Manor was like magic. But gradually, Emma began to be weighed down by all of this, and some of it was even alarming. So it was impossible to leave here without a good reason and Louis' permission. Plus, to go to the city next to the town was a town. You could only go in groups of 3 people, and on return Louis talked to all of them separately. Calls home were authorized again from the office of the owner, that is Louis. Photography and videotaping were strictly forbidden. Sometimes Emma caught odd words like mystery, ritual, initiation, and scraps of conversation. And at some point, Emma realized that the whole place reminded her of a cult. Yes, it did, a cult, and it started to scare her. She began to feel uncomfortable walking in the evenings around the house, on the walls of which hung so many strange pictures of people, noble gentlemen in ancient clothes. Look at a glimpse, and it seems to be just some lord, chevalier, or lady. But look closely and see how from under the hem of a silk dress peek out wolf's paws, and from behind the camisole visible wolf's tail. What were those creepy sculptures of wolves tearing up people's prey? Louis joked, saying that such art is no worse than modern paintings, which are just blots. But Emma did not like it all. She felt increasingly lonely. And then something happened. Among the young people there was a kid named Ben, and he was only 17 years old. He said he didn't want to go. He was fine in New York, but his father had sent him here, saying it was his duty as heir. Ben suffered from a stammer and, as Emma learned, had grown up in the shadow of his older brother, with whom he was constantly compared. Ben was good at French, had an obvious talent for painting and playing the violin, but he didn't like guns or anything violent. One night, Emma could not sleep and she left her room. She was going to the kitchen to drink warm milk with cookies, and her way passed through the gallery, the high windows of which overlooked the garden. The full moon shone in the sky, and in its pale, cold light the paintings on the walls seemed especially eerie. Suddenly, a scream cut through the silence of the night. Emma ducked her head to the glass. She saw a shadow in red running across the lawn. No, it was Ben, and the red was a silk cape, like a long cloak with a hood over his head. Ben stumbled and fell. Emma saw 3 Moonwolf apprentices in similarly strange cloaks run up to him. 2 of them lifted Ben to his feet and dragged him, clearly struggling, in a direction back toward the house. The third man had a torch in his hand and turned sharply toward the gallery. Emma crouched hiding under the window. How frightened she was in these moments. She clasped her mouth with her palms and trembled. She could not understand what she had just witnessed, but she knew on some primal, instinctive level that under no circumstances could she be discovered. When she looked cautiously outside, there was no one on the front lawn. Sneaking around, Emma went back to her room. The next morning, at breakfast in the common dining room, Emma did not see Ben among her students, and it seemed that Ben's absence was not noticeable to anyone else, although she knew for a fact that those who called themselves his friends were sitting there. The day went on as usual. "Ben? He's sick of our company," Louis said when Emma decided to ask the question. She was in his office, and he was sitting at his desk, sprawled in his chair, twirling a black ball of agate in his fingers, tossing it, catching it, and moving it around so that he could barely keep track. Poor guy, Louis grinned broadly and in a way that wasn't quite natural. He was too weak. I had to send him home. What's bothering you? Emma barely suppressed a nervous shiver, smiled back, and said she was fine, but she just wanted to know if Ben should be included in the rest of her program. "Oh no, we won't be seeing Ben again," Louis said, and wished Emma a good day. "Oh, by the way, if you don't sleep well," he said abruptly as she was leaving the office, "peppermint and lime tea helps a lot." "What makes you think I don't sleep well?" Emma asked, chilling inwardly, and she could have sworn that Louis had somehow found out that she had been up the night before, walking through the gallery and seeing things she shouldn't have seen. "Your eyes are red," Louis explained in a sympathetic tone. "I'm just worried about one of my best employees. I really don't want to lose you, Emma." Thanking him for his concern, she left the office. Emma just didn't know what to think about all this, but realized she'd had enough. Emma barely made it to the end of the summer when all the students had left the estate. She could have broken her contract earlier, but she was afraid of angering Louis, and her conscience wouldn't allow her to behave in such a way towards the students, because then they would have been disrupted. "No, we're not going to work with you anymore," Emma said when Louis said he hoped she would come to the estate next year. She said that she had already found a place just for herself as a teacher in a small and quiet town near the Alaskan border. "It's a shame. Such talented, multi-talented people are rare," Louis said, "but if you ever need anything—" "No, thank you. I don't need anything more from you," Emma blurted out, perhaps too hastily, but Louis reacted calmly. "If you ever need anything," he repeated with pressure, "just call this number," he said, handing her a business card. "Like it or not, your name is among those who have done a lot for our common cause, and we don't abandon our own. It's another thing if people refuse our help, but again, if ever something like that happens in your life, just call." Emma swore to herself it would never happen, and the business card she threw away, only the number from it, as if against the will of the girl, firmly, as if forever imprinted in her memory. Emma did what she wanted to do. She moved to a small town and began working as a school teacher of French. She often visited her parents, and then, when she was already well over 30, she met a man who was a simple miner. They realized they were meant for each other and got married. In this marriage, Jessica was born. Years passed. When her daughter was not even 14, Emma's husband died in a mine collapse. It was a heavy blow. It seemed to her that it was not for nothing and that it was retribution for the fact that at one time she worked for Louis. Emma had built up 1,000 theories about what was going on at the Moonwolf over the years, and they all seemed crazy to her. In general, it was none of her business, but sometimes she felt uneasy, especially when she suddenly heard that nearby in the national park, wolves had mauled tourists, or when she learned that the millionaire, allegedly flown in to hunt wolves, missing. Sometimes Emma thought she was going crazy. Once she even had a nervous breakdown, although all that happened was that she saw a report on TV. It just showed some big convention of businessmen, and among them she recognized one young man. I think his name was Alex. Emma remembered him from when she worked at Moonwolf Manor. This Alex talked a lot about how important grip and willpower were in modern business, and then suddenly one of the journalists asked him why you, despite the fact that you were known to visit a beautician, but did not remove those terrible scars from your hands. The thing was that Alex's hands looked as if they were chewed by a predator. He replied that it was a reminder that everything in life has a price, and that sometimes it's important to be able to rein in your demons. Then he made a joke about how illness and trauma are tests that toughen you up. But there was something wrong with this phrase. It was creepy. After she saw that TV program, Emma had nightmares and took sedatives. After losing her husband, Emma realized she couldn't stay in a town where everything reminded her of him. She and her daughter started moving from place to place, southern states, central states. Emma worked here and there for a year or two and then moved again. She didn't feel guilty that Jessica had to change schools all the time, that she didn't have time to make friends anywhere. Jessica didn't do well in school, and she decided that going to college was too much of a hassle. She just didn't see any prospects for herself. And that's when Emma got worried and realized that she was literally instilling in her daughter a love of this lifestyle with her constant moving around. Meanwhile, things were getting worse for the little family. Emma's health began to fail, and soon it became clear that she had to finally settle down in one place. And she realized that what she would like most of all is to grow old somewhere closer to the north. So Jessica said there was an option to go to Alaska. They needed a waitress in a cafe there. Jessica figured that it would be cheap to live there, and since the place was a favorite with tourists, it would be a good place to earn money, so they did. When Jessica met John, Emma didn't like him much, but she also realized that it would be better for her daughter to arrange her fate and settle down in one place. It wasn't a good thing to be a waitress all of her life, and to have a reputation as a frivolous person, which Jessica had already begun to acquire here, after several unsuccessful romances. Emma was also upset by the fact that John already had a child, which meant that Jessica was going to become a stepmother. And then, Emma's condition began to deteriorate rapidly. And the worst part was that she knew it. She plunged into memories and complex reflections on the subject of cultural studies and mythology, then suddenly began to fantasize about how much more prosperous her life would have been if she had accepted Louis' invitation. Maybe she was just a young fool who had imagined all sorts of horrors. But as time went on, Emma began to appreciate the life they had. Yes, she didn't get along well with John. It was clear he didn't like her, but she did get along with his son Michael. And the woman's heart broke when she learned that the boy was sick. Again began to gnaw in the brain vicious temptation to call that phone number, ask for help. But Emma did not do it. First of all, she told herself, no one would answer the phone. It had been years. Maybe Louis himself is no longer alive. And secondly, no, let it be as fate would have it. Because what if the price is too high? And then came the grief of Jessica's death. It seemed to Emma that it would be so much easier to go mad, but madness did not come, just touched her with a soft paw in which lurked sharp claws. She was in such a state and ordered those books on history. She just needed to know something about the history of France. It seemed there is no strength, so eager to read them. Then, when she realized what she had done and wanted to ask for forgiveness, she had no time to ask her son-in-law to leave. It wasn't just cold outside, it was a harsh Alaskan winter. Emma stood in the darkness and could barely make out the lights from the neighbors' houses ahead. She took a step, another. What to do? Was this really the end? Did her life have no meaning at all? She lost her husband, she lost her daughter, and suddenly, with frightening clarity, Emma realized that her grandson was still in the house. Yes, not her own, but how she had come to love that boy. And John, it was clear he would destroy the boy. What's in store for him with a father like that? And so Emma made her decision. The blizzard raged, but the old woman moved on. At one point, she thought she could make it. She would fall, lie down, and that was it. She would be gone by morning, but as if a light was lit inside, as if the chains were pulling her forward to salvation. And soon Emma pressed her stiffened palms against the wall of the house. It was a dilapidated-looking house, but in fact it was a good house. It had been standing in the town for 100 years, and Bruce lived there, a hereditary garbage truck driver and, as they said, a crazy grandfather. However, this man was the one who really understood Emma. The thing was that at one time in his youth, Bruce had worked in a Canadian national park and had seen everything there. He was the only one Emma had ever spoken to. He was the only one she confided what she'd seen at Moonwolf Manor, and Bruce had shared his thoughts with her. And now Emma believed he wouldn't leave her alone in trouble. Just as long as he didn't fall asleep to the old TV, he turned it up terribly loud so he wouldn't hear the cannon shot through the window. The door opened as Emma was about to howl like a wounded animal at the cold pain in her limbs. "Emma," marveled Bruce, and after a moment he dragged the old woman inside. A couple more minutes and Emma was already sitting in front of the blazing fireplace, her legs and arms spreading warmth and pain as they regained sensitivity. Bruce was tending to her like a hen, drinking coffee and trying to feed her a tuna sandwich. "What are you saying?" he asked, leaning toward Emma. "Shout in my ear. I'm totally deaf." "The phone. I need to make a call. Give me the phone, Bruce. I need to make a call." If John had a time machine at his disposal, the first thing he'd do would be to go back to the night before and not kick his mother-in-law out the door. Screw her. Let her spend her money on books. It's probably fixable. They could be returned to the store. But how to get his mother-in-law home safe and sound, John had no idea. He knew in his mind he should go to the sheriff's office, but his knees weakened as he imagined the situation. "My mother-in-law is missing. Help me." He'll tell the police officer. "What happened?" he'll ask. "I threw the old one out in the cold," he'll answer. And then, as John thought, he had every reason to go to jail, and they'd be right. There's no reason for a murderer like that to walk free. His throat itched and he wanted to take a sip, and not of water, but of something stronger. A knock at the door brought him out of his musings, and John jumped to see who it might be. Could it be the sheriff? His feet were already carrying him to the door and... "Emma?" He looked up. Because his mother-in-law was standing outside the door. She was standing there with her head down, sad, but she was alive. Not like a cold-stricken ghost who'd come for revenge. "Can we talk?" she said. "Yes, of course." John swallowed and stepped aside. I have to apologize. I don't know what came over me. I don't understand. I have to stop drinking, yes. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. If you can, of course. It's because of these books. I don't need those books anymore." Emma sighed and tapped her finger on her forehead. "I've been thinking. We need to talk about Michael." Her mother-in-law's return was unsettling on some instinctive, subconscious level, not only in itself, but also because she suddenly appeared, as John saw it, almost sane and lucid. Could it be, he thought, feeling again the prick of conscience, that it was her daughter's death that had affected her so? But he said nothing about it. Instead, he fussed, offering tea, something hot. Emma refused and said that they urgently needed to talk. John obediently sat down on the sofa and listened. And when he heard everything, he frowned. In general, Emma, when she was in her clear mind, gave the impression of an honest, reasonable person. But now she was mumbling inarticulately about the fact that she had an old acquaintance who could help with Michael's treatment, but that she would have to let the boy leave home. "It's some kind of charity, isn't it?" John asked. "Well, you could say that," Emma answered and closed her eyes. This call was not what she had expected. Yes, there was a phone call on the other end, and at first she thought time had turned back because the young voice on the other end sounded like it was Louis. But then she realized it was a completely different person. He introduced himself as Marcel and said that yes, he knew who Emma was and that she had been promised help. Then he listened to her and said that in principle it was possible and could be done if she wanted it. That is, Michael could be cured, and no, she should not worry. No specific fee would be required because he would receive help based on her request, which was not the same as if the request was voiced by the sick young man himself. The man called Marcel said that they would need some time and that he would contact Emma later to discuss important details. And all this, of course, Emma could not reveal to John, so she lied to him about an ordinary acquaintance and the charity fund. But neither Emma nor John did not suspect that Michael himself recently thought a lot about his future and looked for all the ways how he could get a normal life. It all started with the fact that the guy studied forums and chat rooms, which discussed innovative methods of treatment of diseases similar to the one from which he suffered. And so, wandering through them, he came across a link that led to a strange forum where people discuss ways to fulfill wishes. There was something about visualization, superstition with the appeal to the spirits, and similar nonsense in general, something that was definitely not worth taking seriously. But then Michael's attention was attracted by one record. "Hey everybody, yeah, you guys are rocking it." "No, that's not how it works. There's actually a way to get everything you want," wrote a user under the nickname Matador. "Then share it with the people. Or are you all lying and have nothing to share?" A user under the nickname Cool from Idaho asked him. "It wasn't used by me. It was used by an acquaintance of mine. His last name is Preston Rain. Yeah, the same one. He's from a family of rich people. I worked for them when the family was on vacation in Nice. I won't tell you who I worked for. I still want to live. But I was one of those little cogs who's usually invisible, but notices things. So me and this guy, one of the sons of the head of Preston Rains, not that, we became friends, but he is generally friendly with the servants, without Ponce, does not boast of being a millionaire. In general, he had a personal problem, so to speak, something wrong with the brain. He couldn't memorize numbers because of it. Well, then his family claimed that his son had recovered because he was treated in a cool clinic, experimental methods. But I'll say that nothing helped until they asked for help where they needed it. I've heard that story. A user under the nickname Sugar Baby joined the conversation about how Preston Rain Jr. was able to get involved in the family business. I mean, he was a nerdy, shy bunny. He was such a bunny. And then the paparazzi couldn't find him anywhere. He came back 6 months later and became such a man, just like his father. So what's the topic? Can you be more specific? Rush Cool from Idaho. Michael bit his lip nervously. He realized that all this was beginning to sound like some nonsense from a movie script, but it all seemed at the same time tantalizing and somehow very realistic. He looked at the dates of the messages and was relieved that the conversation had taken place not a few years ago, but just a couple of days ago. Michael continued reading. "Anyway, there are some people, or not really people." Matador wrote, "Preston Rain gave me their contacts because I have a problem with my father's debts. He's a gambler. I don't want him to get involved if he's too lazy to get away from the slot machines. But I thought maybe someone could use some help. In general, if there are those who need to turn their lives around, then write in a private message. I'll throw contacts, and then yourself. Yes, it's very important. I'll take this topic down after a while because I don't know if I'll get a kicking for sharing the secrets of secret societies here." "I don't get it," wrote Sugar Baby. "Do you have to sell your soul for help or what?" "The details aren't important," Matador answered her. "Trust me if you're in full. Anyway, there are situations where a person doesn't care anymore what they paid to shovel out of trouble, and my offer is just for those. That's it, guys. Write in private. I warned jokers for the consequences of false, so to speak, calls. I am not responsible." Michael's fingers trembled as he registered on the form and sent a private message to Matador. He didn't care what it said. He described his woes in detail, and to avoid being mistaken for an idiotic joker, he attached copies of his documents, pictures from the hospital, and a bunch of other stuff, which he had digitally stored on his computer. Michael bit his lip again and immediately grimaced with pain. He ran his fingers over it before he noticed that he had bitten it, and now his fingers were scarlet in color. He sat holding the smartphone in front of him, as if like this, without taking his gaze away, he could speed up the events. Then he decided to refresh the page. Maybe someone else had posted something and almost screamed because the thread on the forum had disappeared. Matador had actually deleted it. And that meant that he himself could also leave the forum, and then, for some reason Michael was sure of it, he would not have a chance to find him. But a pop-up window flashed with a reply to a private message. "Hey, Michael, you're in real trouble, I see." Matador wrote, "You know, I like you already. The Smith family name has almost always had a knack for being grateful for gifts, and I'm going to help you out. Wait for the call." Michael wanted to squeal again, but with joy. He had made it. The mysterious Matador had answered him. He must be saved. I don't care what the price is. In fact, Michael was dizzy. He was tired of being incomplete. Tired of realizing that he was a burden for his father, who, in fact, is not even his father. The guy put away the smartphone and leaned back on the pillows, closed his eyes. He was very tired. He wanted to take a nap. And already falling asleep, he thought about that. It was strange what Matador said about his surname. Smith was a common surname. He can't possibly know it, can he? And what's this about thanking him for the gifts? Maybe they have some sort of doctrine about what moral qualities the bearers of different surnames possess, like the way a person's character is thought to depend on his name. With these confused thoughts, and with a desperate hope that he would be helped, Michael fell asleep. The following weeks passed surprisingly quietly in the little family. As far as the definition of calm was concerned, of course, was generally applicable to a situation where a loved one had recently been buried. John unexpectedly got a new job. True, it was necessary to drive her to the neighboring town and work 24 hours a day in two, but it paid well, and since it was to repair mostly trucks, he could no longer fear that again there will be some crazy rich guy who will not like everything. And it was strange, almost frighteningly strange, but he and Emma had struck a peaceful, almost understanding balance. John suddenly realized with unprecedented clarity that he would have to take care of the old woman while she was literally alive in this world. No, of course, theoretically, he could send her to a nursing home. In principle, many people here did not consider such a way out something nightmarish. But, first of all, it would cost a decent amount of money. And secondly, John thought it was a heartless thing to do. His deceased wife would surely condemn him for it, and he decided to let her live with them. Again, it would be some company for Michael, who is definitely turning gradually into an invalid. John thought a lot during these weeks about his non-native son. What to do? He was afraid to think far ahead and hoped that maybe the mysterious benefactor to whom Emma had turned would help. True. Time passed, no one called or came, and John began to think that maybe the old woman made it all up on the background of stress. After all, he arranged it threw him out on a winter's night. In short, John could not part with a gnawing sense of guilt. And then one fine day, when it seemed that spring was not just around the corner, but would come any day now, a cortege of black cars stopped near their house. There was a knock at the door. John went to open it. "Dad, it's for me," came Michael's voice. Clearly overcoming pain and weakness, it was evident from the distorted face. The boy appeared in the living room. John wondered why he was dressed for the street, even though he wasn't going to the doctor today. In general, Michael might have had a couple more acquaintances who hadn't abandoned him, but the people standing outside the door didn't look like them at all. "Good afternoon," John said, and for some reason felt the urge to evaporate, so much so that he didn't like the people behind the door. No, they looked decent, even solid, dressed in black. Ahead of the two shaven-headed men stood a blond man in a black coat. For some reason, a detail that immediately struck the mind was the massive clip on his black tie, depicting a silver wolf's head. Emma, who was sitting by the fireplace with one of her books, dropped it from her hands and it hit the floor. "Louis?" "Marcel," answered the man in the coat. "My father, unfortunately, is already in a better world, but I remembered what he had promised you once before." "And you are this?" John swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, you two know each other. I mean, did Emma call you, that you could help with my son's treatment?" The blond man nodded, then shifted his gaze to Michael. It felt almost physical as the atmosphere in the room was heating up, as if something was about to happen. "Sweet Emma," Marcel began and smiled broadly, as if welcoming, but with a tinge of steely ruthlessness. "Of course, if the request had come from you alone, we would have honored it, remembering my father's promise. However, as fate would have it, it was Michael who found us. And so the terms that you and I spoke of, Emma, are no longer acceptable, no longer essential. Now all affairs we solve directly with our dear Michael. So, young man, are you ready?" "I am ready," he said firmly and stepped forward. "Do you remember what we agreed?" Marcel raised an eyebrow questioningly. "If you come with us, there will be no turning back." Michael glanced at his grandmother and father in turn. "I'm sorry, but I can't live like this anymore. I want to be healthy. Yes, I agree." "In that case," Marcel held out his black gloved hand. "Follow me, dear young man, and fear nothing. You are one of us now." "Wait, son, what are you? Where do you think you're going?" "Emma, what's going on?" John's running after his son or his mother-in-law, who, judging by the way she's slumping in her chair, has a heart condition. "Hey, Michael, Grandma's not feeling well," John called out to him. His son froze for a moment as he stepped out of the doorway. His shoulders slumped and there was bitter regret in his voice. "You're not my family anymore. I'm sorry. I'll remember all the good things you've given me, but it's over. What? Stop right there. John ran after him, but he was just shoved aside by one of those shaved-headed guys. Meanwhile, Michael and Marcel got into one of the SUVs, and in another minute, the whole motorcade was moving easily and swiftly, kicking up clouds of snow dust. True, it was necessary to drive her to the neighboring town and work 24 hours a day in two, but it paid well, and since it was to repair mostly trucks, he could no longer fear that again there will be some crazy rich guy who will not like everything. And it was strange, almost frighteningly strange, but he and Emma had struck a peaceful, almost understanding balance. John suddenly realized with unprecedented clarity that he would have to take care of the old woman while she was literally alive in this world. No, of course, theoretically, he could send her to a nursing home. In principle, many people here did not consider such a way out something nightmarish. But first of all, it would cost a decent amount of money. And secondly, John thought it was a heartless thing to do. His deceased wife would surely condemn him for it, and he decided to let her live with them. Again, it would be some company for Michael, who is definitely turning gradually into an invalid. John thought a lot during these weeks about his non-native son. What to do? He was afraid to think far ahead and hoped that maybe the mysterious benefactor to whom Emma had turned would help. True. Time passed, no one called or came, and John began to think that maybe the old woman made it all up on the background of stress. After all, he arranged it threw him out on a winter's night. In short, John could not part with a gnawing sense of guilt. And then one fine day, when it seemed that spring was not just around the corner, but would come any day now, a cortege of black cars stopped near their house. There was a knock at the door. John went to open it. "Dad, it's for me," came Michael's voice. Clearly overcoming pain and weakness, it was evident from the distorted face. The boy appeared in the living room. John wondered why he was dressed for the street, even though he wasn't going to the doctor today. In general, Michael might have had a couple more acquaintances who hadn't abandoned him, but the people standing outside the door didn't look like them at all. "Good afternoon," John said, and for some reason felt the urge to evaporate, so much so that he didn't like the people behind the door. No, they looked decent, even solid, dressed in black. Ahead of the two shaven-headed men stood a blond man in a black coat. For some reason, a detail that immediately struck the mind was the massive clip on his black tie, depicting a silver wolf's head. Emma, who was sitting by the fireplace with one of her books, dropped it from her hands and it hit the floor. "Louis?" "Marcel," answered the man in the coat. "My father, unfortunately, is already in a better world, but I remembered what he had promised you once before." "And you are this?" John swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, you two know each other. I mean, did Emma call you, that you could help with my son's treatment?" The blond man nodded, then shifted his gaze to Michael. It felt almost physical as the atmosphere in the room was heating up, as if something was about to happen. "Sweet Emma," Marcel began and smiled broadly, as if welcoming, but with a tinge of steely ruthlessness. "Of course, if the request had come from you alone, we would have honored it, remembering my father's promise. However, as fate would have it, it was Michael who found us. And so the terms that you and I spoke of, Emma, are no longer acceptable, no longer essential. Now all affairs we solve directly with our dear Michael. So, young man, are you ready?" "I am ready," he said firmly and stepped forward. "Do you remember what we agreed?" Marcel raised an eyebrow questioningly. "If you come with us, there will be no turning back." Michael glanced at his grandmother and father in turn. "I'm sorry, but I can't live like this anymore. I want to be healthy." "Yes, I agree." "In that case," Marcel held out his black gloved hand. "Follow me, dear young man, and fear nothing. You are one of us now." "Wait, son, what are you? Where do you think you're going?" "Emma, what's going on?" John's running after his son or his mother-in-law, who, judging by the way she's slumping in her chair, has a heart condition. "Hey, Michael, Grandma's not feeling well," John called out to him. His son froze for a moment as he stepped out of the doorway. His shoulders slumped and there was bitter regret in his voice. "You're not my family anymore. I'm sorry. I'll remember all the good things you've given me, but it's over." "What?" "Stop right there." John ran after him, but he was just shoved aside by one of those shaved-headed guys. Meanwhile, Michael and Marcel got into one of the SUVs, and in another minute, the whole motorcade was moving easily and swiftly, kicking up clouds of snow dust. John sat on the porch and finally stopped to understand anything. His son, kidnapped? Or had he gone off on his own with who knows who, thanks to the efforts of his mother-in-law, who had made all this mess? John returned to the house and was pleased to find Emma alive and relatively well, only crying. But that was the least of the problems. So you're saying that your son left home willingly and yet you want us to start looking for him? Colin, the police officer asked. I'm sorry, but if there is no reason to believe that he was forced to do so, and considering that Michael is of age, I'm afraid we can't help you. Well, that's just great. John waved his hands and walked out of the police station. In general, he understood Michael in his right to do what he wants, but it was very troubling for him. Emma, when she felt better, said that she could explain everything and that she would wait for John at Bruce's for that crazy old man. Not that John disliked him, but Bruce was a real oddball. However, in a situation where even the Alaskan police, who had high hopes, refused to help, what else was there to do? Well, tell me about it, John said, entering Bruce's house. And please keep it short and to the point, okay? Bruce, placing a tray with a teapot and 3 cups on the table by the fireplace, nodded. That's all right, but it's going to take some time to tell. It's not as simple as it might seem at first glance, and it's not all that easy to understand. John rolled his eyes. You can't expect anything clear and fast. But he sat down, took the offered cup of tea, and prepared to listen. And Bruce spoke. And he really started from the beginning of the 19th century. Then a stream of people, including the former nobility, poured into Canada, fleeing from the storm of the French Revolution. Some of them brought back legends of their native lands about a certain beast, which looked like a wolf or a demon from the underworld. However, these imported legends were very different from those that had originally appeared in Chevaudin. According to these updated tales, the beast could not be killed. It could only be wounded, and that was the point. The legend said that the brave man who had the guts to hunt down the beast alone in the forests of the mountains and fight with it, defeating it, and not becoming its dinner, would be able to fulfill all his wishes in return. And what do people always wish for? That's right, Bruce grinned and wagged his finger at John. Money, power, fame. Not all, John replied grimly. There are other values. Bruce answered evasively and continued his story. Such dangerous games with the beast, which, as they said, came together with people from Gévaudan, were not very widespread because it was believed that by receiving his gifts, a person simultaneously gives his soul to the power of demons. And also gradually around all of this began to form, well, not exactly a cult, but something like a club of the chosen. It was said to include the surviving former nobility, their descendants, as well as people from the common people who had managed to make a fortune. It was believed that all of them had once played a deadly game with the beast of Toadstool. Winning was insanely good from their point of view, prosperity for you, or even for your entire family. The main thing was to follow some rules, so to speak, the terms of the contract. First of all, to donate part of the money you earned thanks to the beast to this society, and to help its members, for example, using power if it was acquired. Secondly, it was necessary to sometimes carefully attract new members to this mystical brotherhood. Thirdly, not to spoil nature, that is, the lands where, according to legends, the beast dwells. And never hunt its so-called little brothers, ordinary wolves. If someone broke the rules, the beast as if nullified his patronage, and it was necessary for the unfortunate that lost his favor again wander into the wilderness in the forests and mountains to look for him and hope to stay alive. Well, that makes sense. The whole thing, John sighed. But how does it work? What if a person goes and claims to have met a creature, then wealth falls on him out of nowhere? That's where it gets interesting. Bruce squinted. Luck, as they say, and really could start unprecedented. But very often such people just helps this brotherhood, club, secret society, whatever you want, in general, call it, but the essence of the same. Man they support materially. Connections again, have the right connections, in general, pull the strings to make him well settled in life. and they expect favors in return. All sorts of say. They say they control a significant share of the black market of antiques, and something worse too. There are still smart people, by the way, who think that once you get lucky and get everything, you can forget about obligations. Well, they suddenly have bad luck. How do you know all this? John asked. Have you hunted this beast too? In fact, he wanted to say that this is the kind of delusional nonsense that could lead to a diagnosis of schizophrenia, but he refrained from commenting, fearing that they would stop talking to him altogether. I wouldn't have the guts, Bruce grinned. I've seen all sorts of things, and I've talked to all sorts of people. I've not only worked in the reserve, but I've accompanied tourists. I've been around a lot of things in my youth. I just don't understand. Why are they clinging to my son? John clenched his fists. He must have found them somehow, Bruce said. They say they're always looking for young blood, as they say. Talented kids. And besides, Smith, I think. Well, that's right. Rudolph Smith, they say, was the kind of guy who made his fortune with gold after he tamed the beast. My father-in-law disappeared like that. John swallowed hard. So he went to find the beast and make it right. What the hell is going on? Some sect, a bunch of lunatics, has been doing what it wants for 200 years. How can you stop them? Bruce grinned again. He went away for a while and came back with a new batch of hot tea for everyone. Think of it as a business club. Well, they have extreme sports. Well, they want to believe in the beast and climb mountains. Who's forbidding them? Grown men. And if someone falls off into the abyss, freezes, or gets a grizzly on his teeth, well, the matter is in some sense mundane. Pardon the horror of how it sounds. John drank his cup of tea in silence and squinted at the window. It was dark and the blizzard was raging again. Not only had Bruce told him a lot that evening, but Emma had also told him how she worked at Moonwolf Manor. John drank his tea and tried to think things through so that he could make sense of it all without going mad. So what did he have? He had a son who had somehow gotten in touch with the Dan sectarians, and they had dragged him into their games. Yes, it seems if we believe Bruce's words, Michael can really pay for expensive treatment. But at the same time, they will brainwash him so much, confuse him so much that he will go to the mountains like an idiot to look for the mystical beast from Gévaudan. And if he's lucky, he'll come back in, so he'll be tied to those sectarians for the rest of his life. John's fists clenched again. What a terrible thing to do in the world. And no decent people give a damn about it. What the hell are the Canadian and US governments doing? Doesn't anyone care? Doesn't anyone care that harmless hobbies are one thing, but the belief that some otherworldly wolf creature in the guise of a wolf can give riches is quite another and very dangerous. After all, in search of it, people, obviously sometimes not calculating their strength, go into the wilderness and there can die. Where can I find them? John asked. Why do you need them? Bruce squinted. You understand, to compete with them. I'm just asking. And you, be kind enough to just answer if you know, John said with pressure, but politely out of respect for Bruce's age. I just want my son back, and I don't care who took him away, sectarians or that beast from Gévaudan himself. It's been 3 months. Spring was not only just around the corner, it had descended upon Alaska with all the passion of a fleeting warmth, and now it might seem like the sunniest, most blooming place on earth. John, had it been his will, would have gone in search of his son that very day. But Bruce, who, by the way, was convinced that no good would come of it, said that as far as he knew, Michael, as heir to this family name on his mother's side, would be sent to meet the beast in the same place where the founder of the Rudolph family had once done, namely in Canada, in a region near the Great Lakes. Bruce also said that there was the only chance of finding Michael there quickly, and the chances of meeting him there one-on-one were there. For now, the young man is probably in some private enclosed clinic in Europe, or maybe India, or maybe South America. John took a leave of absence from work, and Emma, though it was hard on his heart, had to be placed in a boarding house for the elderly, of course, as he had promised her and himself only for a while. Then it was necessary to buy some equipment for a tourist of the most necessary, and finally, John went to Canada. To say that he was terrified of getting involved would be to say nothing, but it was even more terrible for him to show cowardice and leave his son to his fate. John had traveled to more than one town in the area that Bruce had outlined on the map as the supposed habitat of the beast at this time of year. John, of course, was sure that the maximum who lives there is a wolf, and that, in principle, was also a bit scary. Appearing in the towns, John showed his son's picture to everyone and everywhere and said that he was looking for a boy. The legend was as true as possible. Coral left home, but his family loves him very much, worried about him. And eventually John began to despair because everywhere and everyone answered that no, did not see this young man. But then, yes, he stopped by a week ago, said a man at the gas station and looked glumly from under the visor of his baseball cap. Where'd he go from here? John got up. Over there, he waved his hand at the unexpected witness of Michael's appearance here, waving toward the mountains that rose in the distance behind the town. But he was wrong, and I wouldn't advise you to hang around here alone. Why not? John asked, anticipating the answer. It's a wild place, the man said in a low voice, returning to this business of fixing an old TV set. All kinds of beasts roam around. Anyway, it's not good to be alone here. Thank you very much, said John. Could you tell me where else I could stay? Sheila's Inn, said the owner and gas station attendant. It's cheap and the room rate includes breakfast. Their apple pies are delicious. After renting a room, John could barely talk himself into resting, and walking towards the forest and mountains in the evening was clearly not a good idea. The next morning he had breakfast. The pie did turn out to be very tasty. Then, having bought a map of the area, he took a pre-packed backpack and went on his way. In general, for all the time of his life in America, John had not accumulated any decent experience of tourism, so that everything was new to him, and he did everything guided by Bruce's advice. And though he tried to be careful, but on the first day he was bitten by gnats, almost fell into a trap, and was frightened by the roar of some animal. Then it turned out that it was only a moose. And what a labor it was to put up the tent and make a fire. In general, it seemed to John that he was looking for a needle in a haystack, and in principle, it was so. Well, because it would be more reasonable to stay in the town and wait for Michael to return. But given what John knew, he had a strong suspicion that his son may not return at all, and so he decided to literally act on luck. For the first 2 days he followed the main trail, then turned to some side trail, which was not even on the map. The break at sunset of the next day seemed to John the most wonderful and desirable thing in the world. He was terribly tired. "Father?" A voice came from behind him. John jumped up and almost fainted, though it was only his son. He wanted it, but did not believe that it was possible, and suddenly, Michael, it turns out, came to this clearing himself. And from the way the boy was holding himself, he seemed to be in good health. "What are you doing here?" Michael was clearly not going to jump into his parents' arms. John said that he was actually looking for him and that it was lucky to find him. He said that they needed to talk, that Michael was misunderstanding everything and he was making the huge mistake. "No, you're the one who doesn't understand," the young man said glumly. "Look at me, I'm finally healthy. Marcel helped me as he promised. He made me a new, different person, and I intend to fulfill my destiny. I will fight the beast and earn the right to join the Brotherhood of the 1,000-Year Demon. Sun you." John actually thought he was going to be determined, but he didn't feel like it. "You're wrong. Yeah, they helped. They spent a lot of money on you, but they're crazy, sectarians. Well, what a beast, what a demon, huh? Son, let's go home, huh? Grandma and me." "Father," I said, shaking his head. Michael shook his head. "I'm grateful for everything you've done for me, but now our paths diverge. I must restore our family's prosperity, and with Marcel's help, I will have everything I need. And you? I better go." Michael closed his eyes and bowed his head as if listening. "Go away. He's close." "I'm not going anywhere without you," John shouted. "You're out of your mind, boy. There's no beast from Jevaden." And John was suddenly silent. The sun was almost down. The full moon was rising above the forest. The shadows were thickening, and it was strange to explain, but John too, it was as if he felt something. "You know, you're just a fool," Michael said, taking off from his shoulders something rather large in a pouch. He unzipped the zipper and a crossbow was in his hands. "I'm the chosen one, and he can't touch me. But you? I'm afraid he'll just eat you." John glanced at the trees. He knew that wolves did not climb them, but the branches he could reach seemed very flimsy. However, the natural fear for a man in the wilderness was overshadowed by resentment. His son seemed to be completely entangled in the sect. How am I supposed to get him out? And then it happened. It must have been the clouds over the moon that made it so dark. And the next moment he appeared out of the woods. John had never imagined that wolves could be so big. And he thought that fear has great eyes, so it seems that he is the size of a calf. And he also thought that the beast must be covered in mud and some branches stuck to him. So it seems that on his back he has a hard, as if bony ridge, like a dinosaur. And he also thought that it is just the last rays of the setting sun seeped into the forest and reflected in the eyes of the beast. So it seems that they are burning with fire. And as for the teeth, apparently, the poor animal has some kind of mutation, since they protrude from the mouth, like a saber-toothed tiger. Or is it just fear? Anyway, John had a lot on his mind. Michael, on the other hand, didn't seem to be frightened. He began to read something melodious in French, then knelt down and bowed to the beast. "Oh Lord, spawn of Jevodin, show me your mercy. I do not fear you. Spill my blood and let me take some of yours. I will be your slave and your eternal servant." Saying all this now in English, Michael picked up his crossbow and pointed it at the predator. John was torn by contradictory feelings to run, to save himself. But he also realized that his son, this fool, well, it is clear that this is just a predator and it will tear him to shreds. After a few moments that stretched into eternity, the beast, which had the appearance of a truly worthy demon from ancient legends, leaped forward. It was a majestic, long and deadly flight. John didn't think anymore. He rushed forward and to the side. He was in time. He had time to cover his stupid, fanatical son with his body, not thinking about what would happen to himself. He had time to do it, and then he felt the fangs closing in on his body. He heard Michael scream, felt the stifling, swampy stench from the beast's mouth, and then came such a flash of pain that John simply blacked out. John woke up in the hospital, and at first he was afraid of what if it was that light. The change from the forest wilderness to bed and civilization was very sharp. But the doctor who came to his violent awakening calmed him down and explained what had happened. It turned out that for several weeks the Rangers had been tracking one wolf. The beast had broken away from his pack, was behaving strangely. It was assumed that he was sick with something. He was aggressive and the Rangers feared that he could harm someone. Fortunately, they managed to attach a beacon to him and track him. And how lucky they were to get there in time. They managed to wrestle 2 people away from the predator. "My son," John asked, "how is he?" "Better than you?" The doctor smiled. "He got away with a few scratches from the claws and managed to wound the beast. But you will have a long treatment. But I know you don't have health insurance. But don't worry, Michael paid for all the treatment." John coughed awkwardly. He was sickened to think that he had probably gotten that money from the same sectarians earlier. But it warmed his heart to think that everything seemed to be over, and the wolf turned out to be just a wolf. "You know, you are in the center of such a story," the doctor said almost cheerfully and showed John the latest issue of the newspaper. "You know, there was a cult. In fact, the authorities are investigating the case. The scale of it is hard to imagine. To think of what's going on in the world." John smiled. "Is this really how it ends? Are these scoundrels going to be brought to justice for messing with people's heads? It could be better." John's been in bed for a few days. Quite a few days. The doctor said he should get better and take it easy. "Could you tell my son to come and see me?" John asked me one day. "Unfortunately," Dr. Stewart sighed, "it's not possible." He explained that Michael, when he was also in the hospital, then the detectives came to see him because it turned out that he was also in this sect. He felt just terrible about how it all turned out for his father. And the guy decided he needed to go to a rehab center. It's in France, and that's where Michael flew to. "But he gave you this," the doctor said. John hastily unfolded the letter, though his hands hurt terribly. In Michael's handwriting it said many things, that he was very sorry, that he apologized, that it was hard on him, but he and John, he and Emma had no blood ties, and yet their lives should be separate. But Michael reiterated his gratitude, and there was a check in the letter, a son. Michael wrote that it was the best thing he could do for his family, to give them a good future, help them out with money. Well, screw you, John said a few minutes later, after reading the letter. I did everything I could. I tried to keep my son safe, and since that was the case, he really wanted to tear the check to shreds, but he thought he should keep it. He didn't want anything from the crazy son of a traitor, but Emmett had to be taken care of. After another 3 weeks, during which John was visited by the detective in charge of the cold case, he was finally discharged. He could go home. Finally, the plane taking John back to his native Alaska took off. So, it's not a total failure, but a clear sign, Stewart said, taking off his glasses. He, along with the detective and another chief ranger of a nearby wildlife refuge, sat in a lavishly furnished office. I agree, Jim replied to the detective, but it can't be helped. Every few decades we still have to pretend that we don't exist or that we've been exposed. Let people laugh at the scary tales. We'll cover our tracks, and we'll continue to exist in a different form. How is he? Stewart asked. You mean our new brother or the beast? The ranger squinted. You know, I never ask about the latter, Stewart smirked. I don't have, say, the same level of clearance to our secrets. I don't know at all how much of him is real and how much was created by us 200 years ago. He's fine. Actually, the guy was in shock, but we did a good job with him. He's all ours, and pretty soon, I think he's promising. Marcel says so. And this one, the ranger asked, would it be a problem? No, the detective smiled predatorily. John believed whatever it took. He had to believe it. He clearly preferred lies than the bitter and true truth that tore the covers off the usual picture of the world. He's not dangerous, but we'll keep an eye on him. And that old man, Bruce, no one will believe his ravings anymore. Still, Stewart shook his head. Times are changing. How much longer can we go on without too much trouble? Enough. The raider tapped his fingers on the table, one of which glittered with a silver ring bearing a wolf's face. The important thing is that we are loyal to the beast of Toadstool.